Most organizations treat Fabric Lineage like governance. They are wrong. Lineage is a diagram that makes people feel safe because it looks like control. But control requires authority, and authority requires the power to refuse execution. Most teams don't discover this gap during design reviews. They discover it during audits. When the questions get sharp, screenshots and lineage graphs don't answer them. So this episode does something different. No demos, no UI tours, no click here. Just architecture. 5 inevitability scenarios and a deterministic test you can use to decide what Fabric can and cannot govern. Governance is a verb, lineage is a noun. Start with language because marketing always wins when engineers stop defining words. Governance is a verb. It's something a system does to you. It constrains, it prevents, it refuses, it expresses intent as enforceable behavior. Lineage is a noun. It's something you look at. It describes, it traces, it reconstructs. That distinction matters. A lot of teams conflate these because the output looks similar, a neat graph of assets, arrows, dependencies, upstream and downstream impacts. And in the Power BI era, people got used to thinking, if I can see it, I can control it. Visibility became a proxy for authority, but observability is not governance. Observability answers, what happened, where did it flow, what depends on what will break if I change this. Governance answers, what is allowed to happen in the first place. Measurement versus authority. A speedometer is not a brake. And the speedometer analogy isn't cute, it's the entire failure mode. Lineage tells you the system was moving fast and where it went. Governance is the thing that stops it from crossing the line in the first place. So if someone tells you we have governance because we have lineage, ask a single litmus question. Can the system say no in real time? Not can we find out later? Not can we alert? Not can we open a ticket? No means deny, synchronously, before the action completes, with the same reliability as the action itself. If the platform can't do that, it isn't governing, it is observing. And most organizations don't want to admit how much of their governance is really just post-fact explanations. Dashboards, diagrams, policies written in Word, screenshots in audit packs, a quarterly review meeting where everyone agrees this is important, then grants the exception anyway because the business needs to ship. That's not governance. That's entropy management with good intentions. Here's why the confusion persists. Lineage feels like a control plane because it's centralized, it's visual, and it gives leaders something to point at. It produces artifacts. Artifacts create comfort. Comfort turns into policy. Then the policy turns into an assumption. Since we can trace it, we control it. But tracing is not controlling. Lineage is a forensic capability, a high-quality one when implemented well. Forensics are valuable. They help you debug, do impact analysis, and reconstruct flows. They also help you tell an audit story. And that audit story matters, but it's not the same as reducing risk. In regulated environments, auditors don't just ask, can you explain what happened? They ask, what prevents it from happening again? That's a completely different class of requirement. One is narrative, the other is system behavior. And this is where Fabric becomes revealing, because Fabric is built to reduce friction. Unification, one lake, easy sharing, fast notebooks, pipelines that connect everything. The platform is optimized for execution velocity, which is fine, that's what it was designed for. But velocity and governance are natural enemies unless the platform has an enforcement mechanism that keeps up with that velocity. So the problem is not that lineage is bad, the problem is that lineage is being used as a substitute for authority. Lineage lives after the action, governance lives before the action. If governance is prevention, then the next question is simple. Where does prevention live? The policy enforcement point Fabric doesn't have. Every governed system answers that question with a policy enforcement point. Fabric doesn't. That's not an insult, it's an architectural classification. A policy enforcement point, PEP, is the moment a system evaluates intent and either allows an action or refuses it. And it has 3 properties that matter if you're serious about governance. First, it's synchronous. The decision happens in line with the request, not in a background job. Second, it's transactional. The deny happens before the state change commits. If the write succeeds, the governance layer failed, even if it logs the event perfectly. Third, it's authoritative. It's the last gate before execution, not an observer attached to the side. If you want a simple rule, governance that arrives after execution is paperwork. Useful paperwork, but paperwork. Now look at what Fabric Lineage actually is. Lineage is emitted telemetry. It's metadata about relationships between items. Pipelines, notebooks, lakehouses, warehouses, semantic models, reports. It's a reconstruction graph of this used that and this produced that, built from events and metadata extraction. That's observability. That is not a gate. And the easiest way to prove this without a demo is to talk about time. In a governed system, the sequence is request, policy check, allow or deny, execution. In an observed system, the sequence is execution, event emitted, metadata updated, someone reviews it later. Lineage sits on the second sequence, which means lineage can never be the thing that prevented the action it's describing. It can only describe it after the fact. So when someone says, but Purview integrates with Fabric and Fabric has labels and we can see everything, the response is simple. Where is the synchronous deny? What component is guaranteed to run before the notebook reads the data, before the pipeline writes the output, before the shortcut gets created, before the export happens? If you can't point to that component, you don't have governance. You have an incident narrative generator. Here's what most people miss. A PEP is not a feature. It's a position in the architecture. You can ship 100 governance features and still not have a PEP if none of them sit in the execution path. Tags don't, endorsements don't, Lineage doesn't. Even many security signals don't, because they were designed as classification and visibility first, enforcement second, and enforcement only in certain pathways. And when enforcement is selective, you've already conceded the security model. You've moved from deterministic to probabilistic. We'll get to that, but remember this detail. Partial enforcement is an entropy generator. Now, to be fair to the platform, Fabric is not pretending to be a data firewall. It is an execution substrate. It's a unified surface area where many workloads run against one lake-backed data. That's the value proposition. Reduce integration burden, reduce friction, accelerate time to insight. But acceleration changes the governance problem. It makes after-the-fact controls less meaningful because the system can produce more outcomes in an hour than a governance committee can review in a month. So what happens in real organizations? They replace enforcement with process. They create naming standards. They create workspace conventions. They create gold, silver, bronze tagging. They create review boards. They create tickets. They create training decks. And then a senior analyst needs access by Friday. So the exception happens. And the exception becomes permanent. That is not a people problem. That is what systems do when architecture doesn't enforce intent. This is the uncomfortable truth. Without a policy enforcement point, Fabric governance becomes cleanup. You detect drift, you document drift, you chase drift. Meanwhile, the platform keeps executing. Lineage helps you chase. It does not help you stop. So when you hear Fabric has governance because it has lineage, translate it into the real statement. We can reconstruct what happened after it already happened. That's fine for debugging. It's even useful for audits, but it is not prevention. And if your risk model requires prevention, the prevention can't live inside a component that only knows the outcome after execution. Now, the next step is to stop pretending this is a missing feature you can toggle on. It is an architectural boundary. And once you see Fabric as an execution substrate, the rest of its behavior becomes predictable. Fabric is a router, not a firewall. So treat Fabric honestly, not as a control plane. As a forwarding plane, a firewall is a control plane. A router is not. Fabric is a router. That line sounds blunt, but it's the cleanest way to stop the governance confusion. A firewall decides whether traffic is allowed. A router assumes the traffic is allowed, then focuses on moving it efficiently. If you configure a router like a firewall, you don't get a better firewall. You get accidental exposure at scale. Fabric's job is to make work happen, ingest, transform, model, serve. It optimizes for throughput. It optimizes for reduced friction. It optimizes for just run the pipeline, just connect the notebook, just share the semantic model, just build the report. That's execution substrate behavior. And once you see it this way, a lot of confusing design choices stop being confusing. They're inevitable because the platform has to keep moving. Now, people will push back and say, but Fabric has a control plane. There are tenant settings, there are workspaces, there are capacities, there are roles. Sure, those exist, but that's administrative configuration. That is not an execution time arbiter of intent. Control plane, in architectural terms, means a centralized authority that evaluates requests against policy before forwarding. It means decisions are compiled into enforcement. It means there is a single place you can point to and say, that component prevented the action. Fabric's boundaries don't behave that way. Start with workspaces. Most teams treat a workspace like a security boundary. They assume it's a container that governs what can happen to data inside it. It isn't. A workspace is an organization boundary for items. It's a collaboration boundary. It's a place where roles apply consistently to a set of artifacts. That's useful, but it is not a data boundary. It does not guarantee containment because the platform is designed to connect items across workspaces and across experiences. And the more unified the platform becomes, the less workspace equals containment holds up as a mental model. Now look at capacities. Capacities get treated like governed compute. People assume that if they segregate by capacity, they segregate risk. But capacities are a resource allocation boundary, performance, cost, throttling, blast radius in the operational sense, not governance. They don't recompile intent. They don't evaluate whether a particular data movement should be allowed. They just determine where the work runs and how much of the shared meter it burns. So what actually happens as Fabric adoption scales is predictable. Workspaces proliferate because teams want autonomy. Roles get broadened because delivery pressure beats least privilege. Artifacts get shared because reuse beats rework. Shortcuts get created because duplication feels wasteful. Pipelines get copied because that's how humans operate under deadlines. Each of these is rational locally. Collectively, they are an entropy engine. And this is the unification effect. Reduced friction increases blast radius. When you make it easy to connect everything, you also make it easy to propagate mistakes, oversharing, and unintended flows. The platform doesn't judge the intent, it routes the action. This is why Lineage feels so comforting. It gives you a map of the routes, but it does not act as the checkpoint that decides whether the route should exist. So the system law here is simple. The platform executes faster than humans can govern. Fabric can produce new data products, new copies, new downstream derivatives, and new sharing paths continuously. Meanwhile, governance in most organizations is a meeting, a ticket, a policy PDF, an annual review, a spreadsheet of approved datasets. That tempo mismatch is not a maturity problem, it is a physics problem. If you want deterministic governance, you need deterministic choke points, places where data must pass through a gate before it can leave a boundary, be exported, be copied, be shared, be materialized somewhere else. Fabric doesn't give you that by default because Fabric's core value is removing choke points. So the right posture is not how do we turn Fabric into a firewall. The right posture is where do we place the firewall that Fabric will respect? And once you accept that, the next problem becomes unavoidable. If enforcement is partial, if some paths are gated and others aren't, security stops being deterministic and becomes probabilistic. Deterministic versus probabilistic security. How entropy wins. This is where most governance programs quietly die. Not because the team is incompetent, but because the system drifts from deterministic security into probabilistic security, and nobody admits the shift. Deterministic security means the outcome is predictable. If you attempt an action that violates policy, the platform refuses it. Every time, the rule is stable, the enforcement is stable, and the exception path is either impossible or painfully explicit. That's what auditors think you mean when you say governance. Probabilistic security is the opposite. The system doesn't guarantee prevention. It tries, it signals, it alerts, it labels, it logs, and then, depending on configuration, timing, identity context, and which pathway was used, the outcome might be blocked, or it might not. The organization then calls this governance because it feels governed. But architecturally, it's just a detection and response posture wearing a compliance costume. Here's the key law, and it's not optional. Probabilistic systems always drift toward human exception handling. Because when the system can't say no consistently, humans create the real decision path. The decision becomes, is this acceptable this time? And once that decision exists, it gets reused. Then it gets automated informally. Then it becomes policy. Then it becomes technical debt. Then it becomes permanent. That is entropy. And the thing most people miss is what creates the entropy. It's not only misconfiguration, it's design omission. It's the absence of a universally enforced gate. Every time a platform offers an allowed path that bypasses policy, that path becomes a gravitational well. People fall into it because it works. They call it pragmatic. They call it unblocking. They call it business needs. In system terms, it's an entropy generator. So when you see Fabric environments evolve over time, you don't see one big failure. You see 1,000 small exceptions. A contributor role granted temporarily. A workspace shared just for a month. A dataset published broadly so the exec report doesn't break. A notebook that writes a convenient copy because Direct Lake was slow yesterday. Each one is defensible in isolation. Collectively, they convert a deterministic security model into a probabilistic one. And this is where Lineage becomes dangerous, not because it's wrong, but because it's comforting. Lineage makes probabilistic security feel complete. It produces a graph that implies closure. The system knows what happened. The system can show you the path. The system can prove the flow. But proving the flow is not the same thing as preventing it. Lineage is often used as psychological debt refinancing. The organization feels it has reduced risk because it gained visibility. In reality, it has simply improved its ability to narrate failure. Now connect this back to the architecture we already established. Fabric is a router. It routes execution. It is designed to move data through notebooks, pipelines, lakehouses, warehouses, semantic models, reports. The more unified it becomes, the more routes exist. And if the governance model depends on selectively gating some routes but not others, the outcome is pre-decided. The system becomes probabilistic. And in probabilistic systems, people start governing by etiquette. Don't do that. Use the certified model. Follow the naming standard. Put it in the right domain. Those are not controls, those are requests. Requests do not survive deadlines. So the question isn't, does Fabric have security features? No, it does. The question is whether your governance posture is deterministic, deny by default, consistent enforcement, stable boundaries, and contained blast radius, or probabilistic, allow by default with scattered controls, lots of metadata, and the hope that someone reviews the right dashboard fast enough. And once you're in probabilistic mode, the incident pattern is inevitable. The platform allows an action, the action completes. Then you notice, then you reconstruct, then you promise to tighten controls. Then you add one more exception because operations cannot stop. That loop doesn't end because nobody wants it to. It ends only when the architecture forces it to end. So here's the uncomfortable setup for the rest of this episode. The next 5 scenarios aren't what-ifs. They're the natural output of probabilistic governance in an execution-first platform. Scenario 1 starts with the simplest one. cross-workspace data exfiltration that the platform will happily execute and Lineage will dutifully document after the fact. Scenario 1. Cross-workspace data exfiltration. This scenario is the cleanest proof because it doesn't require malice, advanced tooling, or some exotic zero-day trick. It requires two normal things Fabric encourages: reuse and speed. Start with a dataset, a lakehouse table, a warehouse table, pick your poison. It lives in workspace A, owned by Team A, with whatever controls Team A thinks are good enough. Maybe it's certified, maybe it's labeled, maybe it has a nice description in a catalog. None of that matters yet. Now, Team B has a legitimate business need. They don't want to rebuild the model. They don't want to duplicate pipelines. They want to consume what already exists. So the asset gets shared across workspaces, or it gets accessed through whatever sanctioned cross-workspace pathway exists in your environment. From a governance point of view, the question is simple. Can Fabric evaluate destination context before data becomes resident somewhere else? Because the exfiltration pattern isn't someone viewed the data. It's someone made a new copy under a different boundary. And Fabric's execution model makes that easy. A downstream notebook runs in workspace B, or a pipeline in workspace B writes to a lakehouse in workspace B. The data is read from the shared source, then materialized into a new destination that Team B controls. At that moment, the governance failure has already occurred. The data is no longer only where it started. It now exists in a second place governed by a second set of workspace roles, sharing settings, export behaviors, and human practices, and then Lineage lights up like a Christmas tree. It will show you the upstream asset in workspace A. It will show you the notebook or pipeline in workspace B. It will show you the downstream lakehouse or warehouse in workspace B. It will do its job, traceability. But traceability isn't containment. The architectural proof sits entirely in the timing. The write succeeded. If Lineage were governance, the data would still be where it started. Instead, what you get is a beautiful diagram of approved damage. Now, people will object here and say, but that's just copying data. We can control who can do that. Yes, with RBAC. But RBAC is not intent. RBAC answers, is this identity allowed to perform this category of action? Not, is this action allowed under this policy with this data to this destination right now? That distinction matters because copy in Fabric is not one unified operation. It's many operations across notebooks, pipelines, shortcuts, export surfaces, and compute experiences. If you gate some of them and miss one, the missing path becomes the path. That's probabilistic security. And it gets worse once you consider how organizations actually run Fabric. Workspaces represent teams, projects, domains, cost centers, and experiments. They're not stable security compartments. They're organizational convenience. So the second copy isn't a rare event. It is the natural behavior of self-service analytics at scale. People make local copies for performance. People make local copies for experimentation. People make local copies because they don't want to wait for upstream governance debates. And the platform helps them do it. Lineage will faithfully document every one of those flows. It becomes an exfiltration ledger, and that's the exact psychological trap. Leadership sees the ledger and calls it governance because it looks like central visibility. But governance is the thing that prevents the second copy from being created in the first place, unless a policy explicitly allows it. So the real test in this scenario is brutally simple. Where is the deny before write gate tied to destination context? Where is the control that says, you can read this dataset, but you cannot materialize it into that workspace or that storage boundary? If you can't point to that mechanism as a first-class enforcement step in the execution path, then this scenario is not a risk. It is an inevitability. And once that inevitability exists, every downstream control becomes cleanup. You hunt for copies, you explain copies, you label copies, you try to delete copies, but you never prevented the moment that mattered. Now, the next scenario makes it even more uncomfortable because in scenario 1, the actor at least needed to run a pipeline or a notebook. In scenario 2, the platform hands them the capability bundle up front. Scenario 2, overprivileged, workspace, capacity roles. Scenario 2 is where the governance illusion gets embarrassing because nothing clever happens. No cross-workspace trick, no notebook sorcery, no exotic export path, just roles. Fabric's RBAC model is a capability allocator. It answers who can do things here. It does not answer, should this thing happen with this data right now to that destination. So the failure mode is predictable. The organization grants a role to move fast, and that role becomes the standing exception engine. Start with a workspace under delivery pressure. Someone needs to build pipelines, create lakehouses, publish semantic models, share reports, maybe manage a few connections. The team doesn't want to be blocked by admin tickets. So the solution is always the same. Give them member or contributor. Sometimes admin because it's easier. Those roles are not small, they are bundles. They include actions that look operationally convenient but are architecturally dangerous. Creating new items, configuring and running compute, publishing, sharing, exporting, moving artifacts, and in some cases changing security-relevant settings. Now put a person in that role who isn't malicious. They're simply trying to get work done. They copy a pipeline from another workspace. They create a lakehouse to stage data. They publish a data set so the business can build a report by tomorrow. They share it broadly because the executive group is large and nobody wants to manage it carefully. Every one of those actions is allowed because the role allows it. And the moment the action is allowed, governance has already made its only real decision. It delegated authority to the user. That is the point most organizations refuse to say out loud. They want governance to be a centralized property of the platform. But in practice, in Fabric, governance collapses into role assignment. So Lineage shows up again as the regret ledger. It records what the contributor did. It records what got created. It records what got connected. It records what got shared. And it makes leadership feel like the system is under control because the map exists. But ask the only question that matters. Did any dashboard prevent the action? No, the action completed because RBAC allowed it. Lineage simply documented the outcome. Now add capacity roles into the mix. Capacities are often treated like a governed boundary because they feel platform level. People assume that if the right admins control the capacity, the estate is governed. But capacity administration is still administration. It's not an execution time policy engine. It can't inspect data context and deny a specific right at the moment of execution. It can only define who can manage the environment and how resources get allocated. So over time, you get predictable drift. A capacity admin gets added temporarily to fix a performance issue. A workspace admin gets added because the original owner left. A service principal gets elevated so CI/CD can run. A group gets broadened because managing fine-grained access is annoying. Then nobody removes the access because nobody owns the removal. That is not misconfiguration, that is organizational thermodynamics. And the more Fabric is used as the office for data platform, the more pressure exists to broaden roles. Arun Ulag's framing is explicit. Reduce product sprawl, reduce integration burden, make it easy for business to move. That strategy is coherent. But when easy meets RBAC bundles, least privilege collapses. Because bundles are the opposite of intent. Intent is specific. Bundles are generic. Governance needs intent. Now pause here because this is the moment many listeners will try to rescue the story by saying, okay, but we can just tighten roles. We can just do least privilege. No, you can't. Not sustainably, not at scale. In Fabric, least privilege is not a default posture. It's an ongoing fight against delivery velocity. The system will always trend toward broader access because broader access reduces friction and Fabric is designed to reward reduced friction. So scenario 2 is not a hypothetical, it's the default operating model. You give people the ability to cause impact, then you call the impact governed because you can see it afterward. That's not governance, that's permissioned chaos with high quality telemetry. And once you accept that RBAC governs capability, not intent, the next illusion becomes obvious. Sensitivity labels and DLP-like signals, because a label that can't refuse execution is just metadata theater. Scenario 3, sensitivity labels without execution constraint. Scenario 3 is where people confuse classification with control because Microsoft has trained them to see labels as enforcement. In Microsoft 365, a sensitivity label can mean something concrete: encryption, watermarks, restricted sharing, DLP behavior. It's reasonable to carry that expectation into Fabric and assume if the data is labeled, the platform will block the wrong use of it. That assumption fails the same way every other lineage-based governance assumption fails. Timing. A sensitivity label is metadata. It describes the data. It does not inherently sit in the execution path as a deny gate. And a label that can't refuse execution is documentation, not control. Start with the clean setup. A table in OneLake-backed storage is labeled confidential or highly confidential or whatever your taxonomy is. Maybe the label is applied manually. Maybe it's applied automatically. Maybe it propagates to downstream items. All of that looks like governance because it looks like intent got attached to the asset. But intent is not the same as enforceable behavior. Now, a notebook reads that labeled data, not a malicious notebook, a normal one. A notebook exists to transform, enrich, join, aggregate, and write. That's what Fabric notebooks are for, turning inputs into outputs. The notebook reads the label table, performs a transformation, and writes the result somewhere else. A new lakehouse, a new warehouse, a file export, a staging area for a report, a temporary dataset that becomes permanent. Pick any destination that is less controlled than the source or controlled differently. Here is the critical question governance requires. Does the platform evaluate the label in combination with the destination and refuse the right? Not does it show the label. Not does it propagate the label. Not does it record that the labeled data flowed into an output. Refuse means the output cannot be created, and in most real estates, nothing in that execution path is guaranteed to say no. What you get instead is label propagation theater. The label travels, the metadata updates, and everyone points at the fact that the sensitive content stayed tagged. That is not prevention. Because the risk you're trying to govern is not whether the output is tagged. The risk is whether the output exists in a location where the wrong people can access it, or where the wrong egress paths exist, or where export is easier, or where sharing is broader. A label can't change the physics of access boundaries if the access boundary is a workspace role assignment and a sharing model. And this is where Fabric's execution-first nature makes the problem worse. Notebooks and pipelines are designed to make copies. They are copy engines. If your governance posture depends on labels to prevent copying, you're relying on a signal to stop a mechanism that was built to ignore signals unless forced. So what does Lineage show? It shows the labeled input. It shows the notebook. It shows the output. It makes the flow look responsible because the metadata appears consistent. It even makes the organization feel mature. Look, we have labeling and we can trace it, but nothing stopped the write. This is why people get blindsided in audits. An auditor doesn't care that the copied dataset is labeled confidential if it now exists in a workspace where contributors can export it to Excel or share it broadly or connect downstream systems. They care that the data moved into a weaker boundary, and the platform did not refuse the move. The uncomfortable truth is that labels are often treated as a substitute for architectural containment. Organizations label everything and assume that means the platform is governing. But labels are a description layer. Without an enforcement layer that is both consistent and positioned before execution, labels become compliance decoration. And just like with RBAC bundles, the exception pattern shows up immediately. Someone needs the data in another workspace just for analysis. Someone needs to stage it just for performance. Someone needs a copy just for the board pack. The label remains, the copy exists. The governance team feels satisfied because the telemetry looks clean. Meanwhile, the risk surface expanded. So when you hear, "We're safe because we label our Fabric assets," translated into the real statement, "We know what we leaked." That's not nothing, but it's not governance. Governance means the platform can say, you can't write labeled data into that destination. You can't export it through that path. You can't share it outside that boundary. If the label can't refuse execution, it cannot be your control plane. And once you accept that, scenario 4 becomes obvious. Adding Purview and adding native Lineage doesn't fix the timing problem. It just gives you two observers watching the same failure. Scenario 4, Purview versus native Fabric Lineage. Scenario 4 is the one Microsoft quietly benefits from because it turns a missing control into a perceived upgrade path. Native Lineage is nice, but will connect Purview. As if adding a second lineage graph upgrades observability into governance. It does not. Purview is better at a lot of things. Fabric Lineage is better at a few things. They overlap, they integrate, they create a larger, cleaner story, but they are still observers, and two observers do not equal one enforcer. Start with what each tool really is, not what the marketing wants it to be. Fabric Lineage is workspace-centric dependency mapping. It tells you what items used what other items inside the Fabric execution surface. Notebooks, pipelines, lakehouses, warehouses, semantic models, reports. It's good for impact analysis, it's good for debugging, it's good for what changed and what will break. Purview is an enterprise metadata platform. It builds an inventory, it scans, it classifies, it gives you governance domains, data products, business context, ownership workflows, and critically, visibility across systems that aren't Fabric. Purview is a catalog of catalogs. Fabric Lineage is a local map, but both share the same structural limitation. They operate after the fact. Look at the execution order again. A pipeline runs, a notebook writes, a dataset gets published, a downstream artifact is created, then telemetry gets emitted, then the lineage graph updates, then Purview scans, ingests metadata, and presents it in a unified catalog. That order matters. Because anything that requires scanning, ingestion, mapping, and visualization is not sitting in line with the write operation. It is not a gate. So in this scenario, the organization does what it always does. It takes a weakness and wraps it in a dashboard. They connect Fabric to Purview. They enable the admin APIs. They run scans. They create collections. They build governance domains. They assign owners. They see their assets. They see their lineage. They see their classifications. And then the data still moves because none of that changed the execution pathway. Purview can tell you that sensitive data exists in a lakehouse. It can tell you that it flowed through a notebook. It can show you that a report depends on it. It can even show you the approval workflow for requesting access to a data product. But if someone already has the ability to run the notebook and write the output, Purview did not prevent anything. It simply improved the quality of the narrative. This is why the Purview will fix governance belief is so persistent. Purview feels like governance because it uses governance language. Domains, policies, data products, access requests, stewardship, quality scores. It gives you formal structures. It gives you process. It looks like authority. But process is not authority unless the process is bound to an enforcement point. Otherwise, it's a request, and requests do not survive deadlines. Here's the counterintuitive part. Purview integration can actually increase false confidence because now you have two layers of visibility. When something goes wrong, you can open Fabric Lineage and explain the local flow. Then you can open Purview and explain the broader flow. You can show labels, you can show classifications, you can show who owns what. And because the story is richer, leadership feels the system is more governed. Meanwhile, the actual gating decision still lives where it always lived, in role assignment, and in whatever egress controls exist outside Fabric. So the real test for scenario 4 isn't, can Purview show me the lineage? Of course it can. The test is, can Purview refuse the notebook write right now before the output exists because the destination violates policy? If the answer is no, Purview is not your enforcement layer. It is your observability layer. A valuable one, but not the one you needed. This scenario ends with the same uncomfortable line every scenario ends with. Visibility is not authority. Purview plus Fabric lineage equals better visibility. It does not equal governance. And once you accept that, you can finally see why the illusion exists at all. Microsoft sells unification as safety, and that is the next problem. The Office for Data story creates control plane illusions. Microsoft didn't accidentally create this confusion. The platform story trains people to expect governance because it borrows the most emotionally persuasive analogy in enterprise software, Office. Arun Ulag says it plainly in interviews. Customers were drowning in complexity, too many products, too much integration burden, and the goal was to do for data what Office did for productivity. One suite, one surface, one lake, one place to work. And for adoption, that's brilliant. But Office never promised control, it promised convenience. The illusion happens when organizations translate unified experience into unified authority. They assume that because everything is in one place, the platform must also be the place where policy is enforced. They assume the unification layer is the control plane. It isn't. Office is not a firewall, it's a productivity surface. People can still paste secrets into a document. They can still forward an attachment. They can still save something to the wrong place. Microsoft added Purview, DLP, labels, and retention over time because the base product was about creating and sharing, not enforcing intent. Fabric is following the same pattern. It is a productivity surface for data. And when you hear one lake is one drive for data, you should translate it into the real architectural implication. This is a shared substrate optimized for movement. Movement is the point. Friction is the enemy. That is why it sells. Now add the slogan that gets repeated in governance discussions. Discipline at the core, flexibility at the edge. It sounds responsible, it sounds like a mature federated model. It is also a perfect description of how entropy gets invited in. Because flexibility at the edge is where execution happens. Edge teams create notebooks, pipelines, and data products under deadline. They copy artifacts, they share shortcuts, they publish models, they materialize outputs. And if the platform does not have a hard enforcement point that forces discipline into those actions, discipline at the core becomes a documentation exercise. Central teams write standards. Edge teams root around them. Everyone calls it balance. This is the uncomfortable truth. Federated governance without enforcement is just distributed exception handling. And Microsoft's incentive structure reinforces it. The platform succeeds when it reduces friction and increases usage. It succeeds when teams can onboard quickly, build quickly, and iterate without waiting for a central council to approve every move. So the product pushes power outward. More capabilities in workspaces, more self-service creation, more integration between experiences, and more pathways to get data from here to there. That is not a bug, that is the business model, which means the platform will always bias toward enabling actions first and documenting them second. Control shows up later as overlays, labeling, cataloging, scanning, dashboards, and governance hubs. Useful overlays, but overlays. The psychological trap is predictable. Unification produces visibility. Visibility feels like control. Leaders see domains, catalogs, endorsements, labels, and lineage graphs and assume the platform is governing because it looks orderly. Orderliness is not authority. And the more the platform integrates, the stronger the illusion gets. When Fabric integrates with Purview and Purview integrates with the Microsoft 365 compliance stack and governance language becomes ubiquitous, people stop asking the only question that matters, where is the deny? They start asking softer questions. Do we have a dashboard? Do we have ownership? Do we have labels? Do we have lineage? Those are observability questions. They are not enforcement questions. So the Office for Data story creates a specific kind of organizational failure. It convinces executives that buying unification bought control. It convinces architects that a single platform implies a single policy plane. It convinces governance teams that adding more metadata will eventually become enforcement. And then reality shows up on a timeline, not a diagram, a timeline. An incident happens, a breach, an overshare, a regulatory exposure, how did this data get here moment. And the organization learns, in the most expensive way possible, that the platform can explain what happened. It cannot reverse it. That's the next scenario, because nothing closes the gap between observability and governance like incident response. Scenario 5, incident response timeline. Incident response is where the lineage lie stops being philosophical and becomes a calendar. Because governance is measured in timing, not in diagrams. Here's the standard timeline every regulated organization eventually lives through. Something happens. Data shows up somewhere it shouldn't. A report gets shared too broadly. A dataset gets exported. A lakehouse copy appears in the wrong workspace. Sometimes it's malicious. Most of the time, it's just normal work moving faster than policy. That's moment 1, impact. Then comes moment 2, detection. Maybe it's a DLP alert. Maybe it's an insider risk signal. Maybe it's a user saying, why can I see this? Maybe it's an auditor asking for evidence you can't produce. And the important part is that detection is downstream of impact. Then comes moment 3, the scramble for narrative. This is when everyone opens the same set of tools: activity logs, audit logs, lineage graphs, catalog entries, workspace permissions. People start reconstructing. And yes, Lineage is useful here. It tells you which items used which sources. It gives you a dependency chain. It helps you answer, how did the data travel? But notice what just happened. Lineage entered the story after the outcome existed, which means Lineage is participating in forensics, not prevention. Now, moment 4, containment. This is where the organization tries to stop further damage. They remove access, they lock down sharing, they revoke tokens, they disable exports, they rotate secrets, they update a policy, they create a new security group, they rename a workspace, they move an artifact, they tell everyone to stop using the old thing and use the new thing. Containment is messy because Fabric is unified. The same convenience that accelerates delivery also accelerates blast radius. If a dataset has been reused widely, you now have to unwind reuse. If a pipeline has been copied, you now have multiple copies. If a notebook wrote a derivative, you now have derivative assets with their own downstream consumers. You're no longer fixing one thing. You're negotiating with a dependency graph that grew without you. Then moment 5, reconstruction. This is the part auditors love and engineers hate. You build an incident report, you export logs, you annotate Lineage screenshots, you write the story, what happened, when, who did it, what systems were involved, what data was exposed, what controls existed, what controls failed, what remediation you applied. That report feels like governance because it produces artifacts, it produces process output, it produces a sense of closure. But closure is not control, it's documentation of failure. Now here's the part most organizations don't say out loud. The timeline proves what layer you actually govern with. If the first time you can govern the event is after the write completed, you didn't govern it. You observed it. If the first time you can apply policy is after the export happened, you didn't prevent anything. If the first time you can classify the asset is after it already moved, the classification is just metadata about a new problem you now have. Governance that arrives after impact is not governance, it is incident response, and incident response is necessary, but it is not an acceptable substitute for a policy enforcement point when your risk model requires prevention. So when someone claims Fabric Lineage gives us governance, the incident response timeline is the clean rebuttal. Ask them, in order, when did the system refuse the action? Not when did it show it, not when did it alert, not when did we notice, when did it deny? Because if the answer is, we saw it in Lineage, you've already lost. Lineage is what you open when the outcome exists. You are now doing forensics. You are now explaining damage that was permitted by design. This is why the platform feels safe, right up until it doesn't. Everything looks controlled until an event forces the only question that matters. What prevented this? And if the honest answer is, nothing prevented it, but we can explain it, then you don't have governance. You have observability, plus meetings, plus hope. So stop blaming Lineage for not being a gate. That's not its job. The actual failure is blaming the wrong layer for the right problem. And that takes us to the responsibility map. Who answers who answers what happened, who answers can it run, and who is supposed to answer should it run here now with this data. The responsibility map. Stop misassigning blame. Most governance failures happen because the wrong layer is blamed for the right failure. People blame Fabric for not governing. They blame Purview for not enforcing. They blame Entra for not being granular. Then they add more policies, more dashboards, more committees, and they wonder why nothing gets safer. The system did exactly what you asked it to do. You just asked the wrong layer. So here's the responsibility map, stated the way systems actually behave, not the way product pages describe them. Start with Microsoft Entra, and Entra answers, who are you? And at a course level, are you allowed into this surface area? Authentication, token issuance, conditional access conditions, group membership, role assignments that decide whether the user can even reach the workload. Entra is identity. It is not a data control plane. It does not understand the semantics of this table is sensitive and cannot be written into that workspace. Because Entra doesn't see tables and workspaces as policy objects in the way your auditors imagine. Entra enforces identity posture. It doesn't compile data intent into execution time denies. So when governance teams keep saying, we'll fix Fabric governance in Entra, what they mean is, we'll restrict who can get in. That helps. It will not solve intent. Then there's Microsoft Fabric. Fabric answers, can this run? It's an execution substrate, a distributed decision engine for running workloads, but not a centralized policy arbiter for evaluating whether an outcome should exist. It will happily run a notebook, run a pipeline, materialize an output, publish a model, generate a report. Fabric's core job is to execute within the permissions already granted. So when you say Fabric should have blocked that, you are trying to retrofit should into a layer designed to answer can. Fabric does not do morals, it does mechanics. Then there's Microsoft Purview. Purview answers what happened and what is this data. It catalogs, it classifies, it builds lineage across systems, it supports audits and investigations. It can make data discoverable with ownership, domains, and workflows, which is valuable because most organizations have no idea what they own until something goes wrong. But Purview is still not your inline gate. Purview excels at describing reality. It does not sit inside every execution path and refuse every prohibited action before the state change commits. If you treat Purview as an enforcement layer, you will build a program that looks governed and behaves permissively. And this is where people get confused because Microsoft uses governance language for visibility products. Domains, data products, quality scores, risk assessments, all useful. Still not an execution time deny. So what's missing? A layer that answers the only question governance actually requires. Should this run here now with this data to that destination under these conditions? That's the policy decision point and its sibling, the policy enforcement point. Call it a data control plane if you want, but the definition is the same. Centralized intent compiled into deterministic enforcement, placed before execution, not after. If that layer doesn't exist, governance becomes a cultural program instead of a system behavior. And cultural programs degrade under pressure. Now, to be clear, this missing layer doesn't have to be a single Microsoft product. It rarely is. In most enterprises, it's a combination of architecture choices, constrained egress, restricted destinations, pre-approved pathways, and explicit deny conditions. It is design that makes the unsafe path impossible, not a policy that asks people politely. So the responsibility map is brutal but liberating. Entra, who? Fabric, can it run? Purview, what happened? Missing layer, should it run? Once you assign responsibility correctly, you stop trying to squeeze governance out of Lineage. You stop asking observability tools to behave like enforcement tools, and you stop assuming that unified means governed. Then the rest becomes mechanical. You can test any governance feature by asking where it lives in this map. If it's identity, it won't govern data intent. If it's metadata, it won't prevent execution. If it's execution, it will not judge outcomes. That distinction matters because once you stop misassigning blame, you can finally define governance in a way that survives reality. The 4-question governance litmus test. So if the responsibility map is correct, the next move is to stop arguing about features and start testing architecture. Most governance conversations stay vague on purpose. Vague language protects bad assumptions. We have controls. We have visibility. We have purview. We have policies. None of those statements mean anything until you can answer one question. Can the system stop the outcome? To make this practical, use a litmus test. 4 questions. If you can't answer yes to all 4 for a given control, then it's not governance. It might be useful, it might be necessary, but it's not governance. Question 1. Can the system say no? Not can it warn, not can it alert, not can it log, not can it show me a report. Can it refuse the action? If a user can still copy the data, export it, materialize it, or share it, and the system's contribution is that it documented the action, then the system did not say no. It said good luck, and then wrote a receipt. Question 2. Can it say no before execution? This is where most tools die. Before execution means the denial occurs prior to state change, before the notebook write commits, before the pipeline output exists, before the shortcut resolves into accessible data, before the export lands in someone's downloads folder. If the deny happens after execution, it's incident response, maybe automated incident response, still incident response. Governance that arrives after impact is paperwork. Useful paperwork, not governance. Question 3. Can it enforce centrally? Centrally doesn't mean there's a portal. Centrally means there is one place where intent is expressed and consistently enforced across the estate, across workspaces, across domains, across teams, across workloads. If the enforcement depends on every workspace admin remembering to configure the same settings, you don't have a control plane. You have distributed hope. And hope as a governance strategy has a short half-life. Question 4. Can it fail safely? A governed system fails closed. Deny by default. Contained blast radius. The safe failure mode is nothing happened, not something happened and we'll clean it up. If a system fails open because a dependency is down, a scan didn't run, a label didn't propagate, an exception got added, then you're operating a probabilistic security model. You're betting your compliance posture on uptime, timing, and human discipline. That is not a bet you get to make forever. Now take those 4 questions and apply them to the things people commonly call fabric governance. Lineage, can it say no? No. Can it say no before execution? No. Can it enforce centrally? It can centralize visibility, not enforcement. Can it fail safely? It fails as incomplete telemetry, not as a deny gate. That's not governance. Tags and endorsements. Can they say no? No. They're metadata and trust signals. Useful, not enforcement. Purview catalogs and scans. Can they say no? They can drive workflows and classifications, but unless a policy is enforced in line, scans do not stop writes. And scans, by definition, occur after something exists to be scanned. Even many security features people assume are governance collapse under this test because they only apply to specific egress paths, specific workloads, or specific user experiences. Selective enforcement is still not deterministic governance. Now keep this distinction clean. This litmus test is not saying Fabric is insecure. It is saying something more uncomfortable. Fabric is an execution platform. Execution platforms do not govern by default. They execute by default. So if your governance requirement is prevention, you must place prevention where prevention can exist, at the point of decision and enforcement, before execution, consistently, and with safe failure modes. Say the 4 questions slowly, because you will reuse them in meetings. Can the system say no? Can it say no before execution? Can it enforce centrally? Can it fail safely? And now say them faster, because this is how you spot the lie in real time. No before central safe. If any one of those is missing, you don't have governance. You have observability plus process. The next step is turning this into a decision tree, because architects don't need more principles. They need a routing rule, when to treat something as prevention and when to treat it as telemetry. The decision tree, prevention versus observability. Now take the litmus test and weaponize it. Not as philosophy, as a routing decision. Because in real enterprises, you don't get to implement governance. You choose where you're going to spend constraint and where you're going to accept drift. So here's the decision tree. First branch. Do you need prevention or do you need observability? That sounds obvious, but most organizations never answer it explicitly. They just buy tools, enable features, and assume it all adds up to governed. It doesn't. If you need prevention, the rule is simple. You must design for enforcement before execution. That means you don't start with lineage. You start with choke points. You identify the actions that create irreversible risk. Data leaving a boundary, new copies being created, exports, external sharing, downstream materialization into less trusted zones. Then you force those actions through a limited number of pathways. You reduce the number of ways a human can accomplish the same outcome. Because in a distributed execution platform, multiple pathways is the enemy. Every extra pathway is an extra policy surface, and every policy surface becomes inconsistent over time. So prevention mode looks like this. You don't ask, can we track it? You ask, where can we deny it? Pre-execution gates, controlled egress, explicit destinations, a model that fails closed, a model where the unsafe outcome is impossible without deliberately breaking glass. And in Fabric terms, this usually means you stop treating the workspace as your containment boundary. You treat it as collaboration. The actual containment lives outside it, in network egress controls, in storage boundaries, in pre-approved publishing paths, in external policy engines, in whatever mechanism your architecture can force Fabric to respect. Second branch. If you need observability, then stop pretending you're building gates. Build sensors. This is where Lineage is excellent. Audit logs are excellent. Purview is excellent. Monitoring hubs, activity logs, inventory, classification, ownership workflows. This is the real world where observability wins. Observability mode looks like this. You accept that the platform will execute. Therefore, you maximize your ability to understand, troubleshoot, and explain. You optimize for impact analysis, not containment. You treat Lineage as a dependency graph, not a safety boundary. And you use that visibility to reduce mean time to detection, reduce mean time to response, and improve your ability to answer regulators with evidence. That's valuable. It's just not prevention. Now, the third branch is the one nobody admits, the mixed mode. Most organizations end up here. They have a few prevention controls in a few places and observability everywhere else. This is the default because it feels balanced. But mixed mode is where probabilistic security is born. Because the moment you have some paths are blocked, some paths are just logged, people route around the blocked paths, not maliciously, operationally. They pick the path that works. So if you're in mixed mode, you have exactly one job. Make sure the ungated paths do not exist for high-impact outcomes. If you can't do that, then stop calling the system governed. Call it monitored, and design incident response like you mean it. Now apply the decision tree to the artifacts people love to cite. Lineage, observability, always. Treat it as forensic telemetry. Purview catalog, observability and process. Useful for discovery, ownership, and audit trails. Still not your inline gate, RBAC, access control. It constrains who can act. It does not constrain whether the act is acceptable for the data and destination. So the decision tree becomes a practical meeting tool. When someone says, we'll use Lineage for governance, you respond with one question. Are we trying to prevent an outcome or are we trying to explain it? If they say prevent, you ask where is the deny before execution gate? If they can't answer, the conversation ends, not because you're being difficult, but because the architecture already decided. And if they say explain, then fine. Turn on Lineage, integrate Purview, improve the catalog, instrument everything, build the best forensic story you can. Just don't confuse that with authority. Now here's the part that actually changes behavior. Repeat the routing rule in one line. Prevention lives above Fabric. Observability lives after Fabric. And if you confuse the two, you don't get better governance. You get audit failure with better diagrams, which is why the next section matters, a governance model that doesn't depend on hope and doesn't require a product shopping spree. 30 to 60-day governance model that doesn't depend on hope. Now the obvious question, what does an actual governance posture look like if Fabric Lineage is telemetry, not authority? It looks like governance subtraction, not addition. Most teams try to govern by piling on artifacts, more tags, more domains, more documentation, more meetings. That increases the narrative quality. It does not reduce the number of ways data can escape. So the 30-60-day model starts with one ruthless move. Remove pathways, not educate people to behave. Remove the ability to bypass intent. Week 1 and 2, define explicit deny conditions. This is not a policy document. This is a set of outcomes that are architecturally unacceptable. Sensitive data materialized outside approved workspaces, data exported to unmanaged endpoints, data shared externally, high-risk assets copied into personal or exploratory zones, workloads running with identities that cannot be traced to accountable owners. Write them as deny statements because that forces clarity. This must not happen. Week 3 and 4, externalize enforcement. If you need a deny before execution gate, put it where a deny can exist, in the paths that create new state. In practice, that means you pick controlled egress points and make them boring, publishing pipelines that are the only allowed route into curated zones, approved destinations that are the only allowed place sensitive outputs can land, network constraints that make just write it somewhere else fail. This is the part people hate because it reduces freedom. Good. Governance is the deliberate reduction of freedom for high-impact actions. Week 5 and 6, reduce Fabric privileges. Stop treating contributor and member as default developer roles. They're capability bundles. Bundles create entropy. So you shrink who can create new items, who can publish widely, who can share, who can export, who can manage connections. You do it with groups, not people, because people move and groups are the only scalable unit of intent. And when someone says we need admin just for this one thing, you treat that as a break glass event with an owner, a time limit, and an audit trail. Not because you love bureaucracy, but because temporary admin is the most common permanent condition in Microsoft estates. Week 7 and 8 formalize Lineage as audit-only telemetry. This is a psychological change, not a technical one. You stop using Lineage to argue that you're governed. You use Lineage to answer 3 things: what depends on what changed, and what happened. You align Lineage with incident response and operational troubleshooting, not prevention. That keeps the tool honest and keeps your governance posture from turning into theater. Now, notice what I didn't say. I didn't say go buy more governance products. I didn't say turn on every feature. I didn't say build a bigger catalog, because the core issue wasn't a missing dashboard. It was a missing enforcement layer and too many allowed paths around intent. When you subtract pathways and you constrain high-impact actions into narrow enforceable routes, the platform becomes calmer. The blast radius shrinks, the number of exceptions drops, and the system starts behaving deterministically again. Then Lineage becomes what it should have been all along, a forensic graph that helps you operate, not a comfort blanket that helps you pretend. And once you do that, the final reframe lands cleanly. Fabric didn't fail at governance. Your assumption did. Fabric Lineage explains what happened. Governance prevents what's allowed to happen. Confusing them turns your data estate into conditional chaos. If you want the next step, the next episode designs an actual data control plane and explains why Microsoft doesn't ship one by default. Subscribe and send this to the person who keeps calling dashboards controls.